Good evening, campers, dreamers, and babysitters. And yes, we are back here with another list here on the channel, this time covering some underrated horror movie monsters. Now, throughout the history of horror, there has been a lot of great movie monsters captured on screen. Some of the most notable from the 1950s into the 1980s. I mean, you have things like John Carpenter's The Thing, my personal favorite, The Blob, American Werewolf in London, a lot of great creature features out there. But, those ones stand at the top of the tier. A lot of people talk about those. Those are always in the conversation when you're bringing up creature features. So when we were throwing around ideas for top fives, these kinds of lists that just pique our interests, I had thought of let's talk and discover, or uncover rather, some underrated horror movie monsters. Now that's from a lore perspective as well as just a creature design, because a lot of them do fly under the radar as we talk about our usual suspects. So without further ado, let's hop into the top 5 underrated horror movie monsters. Coming in at the number 5 spot is Mosquito from 1995, directed by Gary Jones. A violent massacre caused by human-sized mosquitoes forces the lone survivors to band together in a fight for survival as the mosquitoes continue their onslaught. Now this one is just freshly crossed off my watch list. This one I'd seen circulating around online. I'd seen some stills. Some of the pictures looked interesting just from that creature perspective, as well as just the idea behind it. This one flew under the radar for me and had been on my list to watch for a long while now. So as I was thinking of a list to put together, I said, let me give Mosquito a watch, and I gotta say, it did not disappoint. Now looking at this one and all the other films that are going to appear on the list here, this one is a little more low budget, so when you're going into this one, expect that, because if you don't, maybe it could affect your watch. But I gotta say, overall, this one was rather well done. Getting into the lore here, now I don't want to spoil it, it does happen very early on. I absolutely love the idea behind why that these mosquitoes are ginormous. It's just something rather intriguing. They're kind of melding in a different subgenre there. They don't spend a lot of time on it, but just giving you that motivation and the understanding of what is exactly going on, it's pretty creative. And this being more of a low-budget type of film, you would think that maybe the director and the crew themselves would shy away from showing too much of the actual creatures themselves, but I gotta say, they did not in the slightest. They really used that mosquito aspect to its fullest extent. They get them into some creative kills. There's one in particular that if you haven't seen this film, toward the end of it, you're going to absolutely love. It's just so jarring, and pretty graphic, but, a little comedic as well. And this film does teeter that line of mixing comedy with those horror elements, and they really dive deeper into the horror sci-fi elements of things rather than the comedy, but that idea is still there. But it's not something that's eye-rolly in the slightest. I think when we have that comedic timing, it absolutely works. And of course, when you have creatures like this and they use them to the fullest extent that they do, this is something that if you're a creature feature fan, definitely go out of your way to see this. Now, it's not streaming on anything as of right now. I did have to buy the Blu-ray for this one, and I gotta say, I absolutely love that this is in my collection now. This is going to be something that I am going to rewatch, and there is an endless rewatchability to this. Plus, we do have Gunnar Hansen in this film, and if you want to see him dust off the chainsaw one more time, this is a must-see for you. Coming in the number 4 spot is Ernest Scared Stupid from 1991. This one's directed by John Cherry. Ernest accidentally unleashes an ugly troll that plots to transform children into wooden dolls in the town of Briarville, Missouri. In the synopsis there, it does say troll, but it looks like his official name is Trantor. But this one had me hooked as a little kid. I gotta be honest, Jim Varney as Ernest was a staple of my childhood. I mean, he saved Christmas, he went to prison, he even went to camp at one point. But Ernest Scared Stupid for me was just a natural fit with my love for horror, even as a kid. This one had me hooked as a kid. I gotta be honest, going to the video store, this was always at the top of my list. Just knowing that this was Halloween themed and an Ernest film, just seeing him on the front cover with that pumpkin, I didn't even know what to expect just going into this one. But as soon as that troll is introduced, I gotta say, I was in awe as a kid. Even as more of a comedic film, this one has such a strong opening with the tension. There's a little girl running, and they conceal the troll. We only see the bottom half and before he is captured, and then hijinks ensue, and then he's released a little bit later into the film, and they make it such a centerpiece when you actually do see the troll himself. During his full introduction, they really do lean into those horror elements that get you scared as a kid, but even revisiting this as an adult, I gotta say, those horror elements do absolutely work. In comparing this to something like Mosquito that appeared on the list, this one is a pretty much a full-blown comedy with some horror elements to it. So, sometimes that doesn't necessarily work in terms of building that tension or building any sort of terror, but when the troll is on screen, especially bringing this idea that he's stealing children and turning them into wooden dolls. What an intriguing concept this is, especially the way that it is portrayed on film. There's a chase scene in here between one of the kids and this troll, and it's downright terrifying. This troll creature is created by the Kyoto brothers, which we all know from Killer Clowns from Outer Space and several other horror films. So, this thing is absolutely well done. If you haven't checked out Ernest Scared Stupid, and I know this may not appear on a lot of horror fans' lists, this is something I would seek out and just check out the creature effects here. There is almost an evolution that we get toward the end of the film with Trantor, and it just is something that is awe-inspiring when we look at creature effects. So I think this one does fly under the radar, this being more of a comedy film, an earnest film, that a lot of people don't necessarily dissect this one looking for horror elements, but the way that this troll is portrayed, the way that it looks from a design perspective, it's just downright gross. Ernest calls him Snot-Nose a lot, and those elements of disgustingness with the terror that it brings, it just works so well on screen, whether this is an actual horror film or not. So while this one does fly under the radar for a lot of horror fans, I would definitely seek this one out. I think this one does need more praise just from a creature perspective alone, and it's got a lot of great terror elements to it. Bad Moon from 1996, directed by Eric Red, comes in at the number 3 spot. After being bitten by a werewolf in the jungle, Ted looks for a cure. His lawyer sister, with a son and dog, invites him to park his camper by her house in the woods and live out of her fridge. Going off that little synopsis there, I gotta say, it does seem like a little less of a complex kind of story than what we've been getting with some of these creature features, but I think the simplicity of Bad Moon is why this film works so well. This film opens up with an absolutely wild kill. It really gets you set for what you can expect throughout the film, but this isn't an all-out gore fest, I gotta be honest. The simplicity of the story and really leaning on that family dynamic, this is more of a secluded kind of story where it does take place more so outside of the town. We're not really getting deep into those town roots of a bunch of different characters. It really is just a smaller cast, this familial element here thrown in with this other werewolf kind of element. The director, Eric Red, is known for writing Near Dark as well as The Hitcher, and those are two highly regarded horror films amongst fans. While I don't put Bad Moon up there in terms of writing skills, I think this one definitely does show some talent, leaning into that familial element and then sprucing in those werewolf kills, really kind of juxtaposing from scene to scene, really keep you on the edge of your seat. While we're not getting kill after kill after kill, this film really does take its time and lets you breathe and lets you sit with the family and almost forget that you're watching a werewolf film until that full moon rises and we start seeing some more werewolf kills. And then when they do show those on screen, while they're quick, they make them count. There's some pretty graphic scenes in here. Nothing like, I would say, that very opening, which is rather graphic, and it really does extend. Some of these kills are a little quicker, and when we finally get to see the full-blown werewolf, it is totally worth it. This, for me, is probably one of the best werewolf designs that I have seen. While this doesn't hit probably my top 5 of werewolf films, I gotta say this is easily in the top 5 of werewolf creature effects, just because this thing is something you need to seek out, and if you haven't seen Bad Moon, it's worth it just to see the werewolf alone. There's just a perfect mix of human and wolf in this design here. You can still see the humanoid-like figure underneath the werewolf, and those are some of my favorite designs, just because it's uneasy to know that there is still a human form somewhere deep in that werewolf. This one's a rather short watch as well, coming in at about an hour 20 altogether. So this one really is a breeze to get through. And like I said, you really spend a lot of time with the family. You feel like you're part of that family. And then once they get into the gore of this thing, it's totally worth it. So if you haven't checked out Bad Moon, I'd put this on your list. Scooping up the number 2 spot is The Island of Dr. Moreau from 1996, directed by Richard Stanley and John Frankenheimer. After being rescued and brought to an island, a man discovers that its inhabitants are experimental animals being turned into strange-looking humans. All of it the work of a visionary doctor. This is a film I checked out as a little kid, and I gotta say, it has stuck with me throughout the years. Now, this film has its shortcomings, but I don't think it's talked about enough, especially from a tension perspective. As I mentioned at the beginning, this has dual directors, and not by choice. There's a full-on documentary out there about the controversy of this film, which I highly recommend deep diving into that one because it is pretty wild. But looking at the film overall, I gotta say Richard Stanley and the initial crew that was on this had a very specific vision of taking H.G. Wells' work and kind of modernizing it into what we do see, for the most part, on screen. This film has a lot of layers to it from a horror perspective. As we're introduced to it and we get on the island through our main character, we are introduced to a bunch of characters that have been DNA spliced between human beings and a certain animal that they come from, and they're walking on their feet. Some of them are vocalizing. It is a film that is pretty uneasy just from a visual standpoint. And the main focal point of this film, once all hell breaks loose from an antagonist standpoint, is the hyena swine. Now, this is a rather intriguing performance as well as character design, because for me, I just rewatched this, and it still absolutely works in terms of how uneasy and unsettled I get just watching this performance. The creature is played by Daniel Rigney, who unfortunately passed away only a year after this film's release. I did want to look up to see other performances from him because I think this is so well done. Unfortunately, we don't get too much that has been out there just because of his untimely passing. But I gotta say, his performance as the hyena swine, it looks great, but the way he carries himself is even more unsettling. He's kind of got these droopy arms and this unsteady walk to him, obviously, as he's trying to revert back to his animalistic ways of walking on all fours. And you can kind of see that always wanting to get back to walking on all fours. And I think that kind of nonverbal performance adds so much to this character and how unsettling it is. One of the other layers to this creature is also the humanity that is brought to this character that we don't see really from any of the other creatures that are going to appear on this list. What Dr. Moreau is doing on the island is using human DNA and splicing it in with an animal counterpart, and what comes with that is an appearance that is certainly jarring, but with the hyena swine, there's almost this humanity, this consciousness that he wrestles with. There's a point in this film where he actually kneels down and asks Dr. Moreau, "What am I?" And that scene is just such a pivotal moment in this film, because all hell does break loose shortly after that. But you can tell what is going on in the consciousness of the hyena swine is something we don't get in a lot of creatures here, and it continues to be a theme even throughout the duration of the film. While the island of Dr. Moreau does falter in certain areas of storytelling, there is this element that anything can happen and things are just going to get worse and worse. And from a horror fan's perspective, I gotta say, that's something that is hard to capture throughout an entire film. But I gotta say, the island of Dr. Moreau continues to be so uneasy, unsettling when you watch this, and the hyena swine as that driving force throughout it is something that you just have to check out. Capturing the number 1 spot, the creme de la creme of underrated creatures in horror movies, is Slither from 2006. Directed by James Gunn, a small town is taken over by an alien plague, turning residents into zombies and all forms of mutant monsters. And of course, with Slither, we are talking the main antagonist, Grant, played by the national treasure that is Michael Rooker, in just a phenomenal, likable asshole kind of performance, I would say. Major props to James Gunn for this film, coming out in 2006 and really capturing that small town kind of 80s feel that we get in things like The Blob. That I think around 2006, it was such a lost art at that time. We got it in an overabundance, really establishing it in the 80s, it felt like. And then maybe it lost its way in the 90s for the most part, and certainly into the 2000s as we kind of got into a different feel to horror. And then I think with things like Stranger Things coming back up, they were able to recapture that small town feel and really that storytelling of creating these almost formulaic characters, but giving them some teeth to them and feeling a little bit different, which I think James Gunn did here. You know, we have the mayor, we have the sheriff, and then just other characters in the town. This really does feel like an open world. Once we get into our creature aspect of things, with Grant, basically being body snatched in a sense. We're only with him for a short time while he's conscious. Then once he becomes body snatched, he's more so just this kind of weird character, just going through life looking for meat and just another host. And I love that element because we establish this world so much. We have Elizabeth Banks playing opposite role of Grant, his wife, which she's an absolutely likable character. So that plays so well with this threat being inside of her house. And then just Grant going throughout his day and really not knowing how to be a human being but trying his hardest to. It just opens up with so many comedic elements to this while also keeping that science fiction horror element, which they balanced really well in this film. And then as we focus on this creature of Grant and his descent from being this human into what we see toward the end of the film in this just kind of hunk of flesh monstrosity, it's really well done. This is kind of akin to something like The Flying Seth Brundle on, I would say, not as subtle as The Fly. This one, we do get those stages of Grant falling into, being human in one scene, and then he kind of gets a little worse and a little worse until there's a particular scene in here where he's full-blown mutant, in a sense. This film does have some sprinkles of CGI that don't necessarily work, but when the practical effects do shine here, they really shine, especially toward the end of this film. I love this design. It is something that is very jarring. I'm willing to bet a lot of horror fans have already seen this film, but I would put this creature effect up against a lot of the most iconic ones just because of the care that was put into this. And then the lore that is attached to this with this creature that is from another planet, but we don't deep dive exactly what the main goals are, the extensive past of this creature. We just get little sprinkles of what exactly has happened in the past as we have these other creatures that you see that are these little slugs that want to take over their host. You kind of get little sprinkles of what their home planet was or other planets that they've been to. And I love that host element to it where they're all one big hive mind. And then once we get into the very end here and we're full-blown, Grant is this giant mutant, but we still see a little bit of that humanoid figure. It's just this mesh of flesh, and it is just so well done. James Gunn really found a happy marriage between some comedy, the sci-fi elements, and the horror and creature feature aspect of this film, and it really does not pull any punches. This is so reminiscent of the 80s. It takes you on that thrill ride, has a lot of familiar beats that we love in some of our most iconic 80s horror films. So this one is a must-see in terms of if you're a creature feature fan. I'm willing to bet you've seen it, but hey, turn this one on because it's such a rewatchable type of film, and the creature effect here is just stellar. Well, there you have it, guys. The top 5 underrated horror movie monsters and creature effects. I gotta be honest, this one was so much fun to do. Rewatching some films I hadn't seen in a long while to see if they were gonna make the cut, and I gotta be honest, there is a long list that did not make the cut here. So if you're interested in a part 2, we are putting together some Splatter-a-thon content still, so let us know. Hit us up in the comments. You won't have to twist my arm to deep dive into some more creature effects. So let us know, and if I overlook something, hit us up in the comments as well. Let us know. We'll definitely formulate some sort of discussion and get your opinions and thoughts, but also check out everything else on the channel. We got a lot of reviews up, always coming up with some sort of list every week for you that Dylan or myself will put together. But until next time, I'm Luke Janesco, and stay scared.
Do the horse shit, gonna do it live. Cause Splattercast kick it every day they live. Splattercast, gonna smash your ass. 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 Splattercast, gonna smash your ass.